So, science. That's a big thing, isn't it? And it's fundamentally different to religion, or is it? Religion, and it's no real problem actually, if you say religion is based on belief, everybody who is religious is going to go, yeah, of course it is, that's the point of religion. If you say that science is based in belief, if you're lucky not to get strung up on the nearest lamppost, you'll certainly get an awful lot of people telling you it's not. Now, I would say, actually, science and religion are both based on belief, and actually there's not much difference between the two of them. And that, of course, is a heresy. But let's have a look at this for a second. I mean, let's take all those people who aren't scientists. And that's a lot of people. Scientists aren't a huge part of the population. They're a small part. Let's be generous and say 20%. 80% of people who are not scientists take the word of a scientist on faith. If a scientist says something to you, how often do you pick up the paper, read his research, read around his research, have a look at people who've disagreed with him? How often do you do something like that? I would guess never. I hardly ever do it myself, and I do a lot of research because it's just so much. So when somebody tells me something, they tell me they're a scientist, then I accept that on trust, on faith. I just believe it. So there's a huge part of the population who agree with science based on nothing more than belief in science. And it's great. I mean, it sells toothpaste and it sells hair shampoo and it sells you on the latest idea about what makes a good car. Science has a tremendous impact on the population purely because the population believe that science has value. So that huge part of the population is just believing in science. What about the scientists themselves? And scientists themselves will tell you it's not based on belief, it's based on the rigorous examination of the world, and it's based on nothing more than discovering the facts, uncovering them and laying the facts bare in front of you to make infallible conclusions based on that work of fact. That's what they'll say. They'll also tell you how long it takes to train. So a scientist is somebody who is trained for years in the art and practice of science and is continuously reviewed by his peers to make sure that the ideas he's saying are scientifically correct ideas. And they'll hold those things up to you. Now, there's a few things that's wrong with that as it happens. One thing is, of course, your peers are just a group of people around you at the same ideology shared, the same level, if you like. So if you're in a madhouse and you utter some nonsense and everybody around you nods their head in agreement with you, it doesn't make it fact. It just means that everybody agrees with you. And whatever that nonsense is, if everybody holds the same nonsense and nods their head, then it gets the image of fact because everybody's agreed with it. But fundamentally, it could well be nonsense. Just because your peers agree with you doesn't make it fact. It just means that everybody agrees with you. Because there's strength in that. There's strength in everybody agreeing with you and then presenting it. Of course, in science, not everybody agrees with you. Actually, you usually get a huge division between people with argument on both sides that usually comes down to, well, sometimes it's this and sometimes it's that. Because we don't get that. What we get is a summary that's presented as fact. But very, very often, those facts actually are just a summary of something that depends on the situation it is, and just because everybody in the scientific community agrees with it doesn't make it any more right or wrong than anything else. Of course, scientists will tell you all about the training and all about that dedication that they have, all about the search for the truth. And to be honest, there's no difference in what they say from what was being said in the Middle Ages in England by the priest community. The priests used to say exactly the same thing, and now the scientists are saying exactly the same thing. Of course, science is a human activity. It's an activity done by people. And there is one thing we know about stuff that's done by people is it is motivated mostly by people's wishes, hopes, desires and investment in time. Scientists, in theory, are one thing. Scientists in practice are something else entirely. Newton, for instance. Newton hated a guy called Hooke. He hated him so much that they were contemporaries. They hated him so much they had all his portraits destroyed. He refused to publish any of his papers, and he vilified him and hounded him out of the Royal Society. Newton, in fact, was as mad as a bag of kittens about to be thrown into a canal. The guy was a lunatic. He was crazy off the wall, unhinged, and yet we worship him. We don't worship him, of course, we worship Newton's three laws. Because Newton's three laws weren't invented by Newton, Newton added the third law. The first two laws he stole from somebody else. But this guy used to stick pins in his eyes, not little pins, but big bodkins. He used to stick steel rods in his eyes to investigate his optics. He really was a loony. And he was the guy we revere as a scientific personality, a scientific god, if you like. And yet he was a person with his own personal foibles. And we see that now as well. If you say something against the scientific thought of the moment, then your career is over. There's a huge amount of pressure for a scientist to agree with other scientists. Otherwise, he will be vilified and strung out there as a heretic and an apostate and never work again. So science, as practiced by humans, actually is very insular, forces people down one route, and hell to play if they deviate from that route. Now, the idea of science is that it's a steady accumulation of knowledge over time by discovering facts. Actually, in practice, it's far from that. In practice, science resists change. It doesn't like new ideas. It will vilify new ideas. It will tear people's careers to pieces, and the history of science is littered by that, until an idea becomes so strong that it overcomes that and we accept it as a new idea, and that's called a paradigm shift. But before a paradigm shift happens, science is practiced by people in almost the same way as religion is practiced by people. That is, if you say something heretical, you can more or less be sure that the scientific Spanish Inquisition is going to hang you out to dry. So science practiced by people is something different to science in theory. And of course we have this massive word, and this is the word that's always thrown out with arguments like this. Ah yes, but if. Ah yes, but if is, is going to be followed by something that is never going to be true. So, ah yes, but if the world was a perfect place and we could grow all the food that we needed, we wouldn't have world hunger. Well, that's very true. You can't disagree with something like that because it's set up a precondition that you just can't disagree with. So when you argue against a scientist, they'll go, ah yes, but if all scientists behaved in a certain way, science will be wonderful. Well, you can't disagree with that. It's perfectly true. If that were true, then that would be true. Of course. The problem is, of course, it's not true. It doesn't work like that. People behave like people, not like angels, and so that if is usually just a construct. It doesn't mean anything. People are just saying that to set you up for the answer. The if suggests something that might happen, but actually never does, because people are people. I think it was Max Planck who said science doesn't advance because a paradigm shift occurs because the truth of that was universally accepted and the old idea was thrown away. He said that it advances because the proponents of that idea basically die, and the new breed of scientists, the new generation of scientists, come up familiar with the new idea and adopt it. So if you like, science doesn't advance because of the recognition of truth. Science advances one funeral at a time, which I thought was a brilliant way of putting it. And how people as people operate, whether it's in science or any other field, we hold dearly to our ideas. If that idea is prevalent, it will hold power. When those people die, the idea dies, and to a greater or lesser extent, that's in fact how science has advanced historically. Now, science has two methods of coming to its conclusions. One is called inductive reasoning. We take a whole load of experiments and we add it all up and we say, because that happened yesterday, it's going to happen tomorrow. So think about the turkey that's getting fed throughout the year. Every day the farmer comes along and feeds him, and the turkey thinks, here comes the farmer to feed me, until, of course, he gets his neck wrung for Christmas. That's the problem with inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning can only tell you what went before. It can't tell you with 100% certainty what will come in the future. It's a probabilistic answer. It's an answer that says this truth is likely to be true because it's occurred all that times in the past. Now there's another called deductive reasoning, and this was a thing that Popper was on about. He said that what you do is you make a bold statement about something, and then you go about testing it to see if you can prove it to be false, and it was called falsification. So the statement would hold true as long as you could collect data to show that it was true, and you didn't collect any data to show that it was false. Again, that has a problem. So let's say we have an idea, and we go out and set up an experiment, and we can find things and say, well, it's not that. Oh, it's not that. Oh, it's not that. So this scientific method can't tell you what something is, but it can certainly tell you what something is not. So whichever scientific method you use, actually, you're not uncovering facts. What you're doing is uncovering things that might be true, which is kind of awesome if you think about it. Now, the reason it gains popularity, the reason it is significant, because I do not disagree in the least that science is useful. Science is tremendously useful. And the usefulness of it is what's pushed it forward. That I don't disagree with at all. But the idea that science holds the key to truth, that's something I disagree with fundamentally, because science is unable to get the truth. Science can get ideas that can be useful and can stand for a while, and that's far from the truth. It's not only that science is basically giving us its best guesses, which are useful for a period of time, there is also a whole bunch of problems that science is just not applicable to. So usually things like human relations, love, wants, needs, what is better, that sort of thing. Science has no hold on it, because how do you define what is better? That aside, it was Gödel who came up with the idea that some problems were unsolvable. And a simple example of that is, this statement is a lie. There is no way of proving whether that's true or not. Now that might seem a little esoteric, but it was applied to something called the spectral gap theory in physics. The spectral gap is the energy gap between the lowest ground state of something and the first state of excitation. So it's actually really quite important, because it's responsible for things like light emission and the semiconductor performance, that sort of stuff, the solar cells. And it was found that there was no way to predict whether a material would be gapped or gapless. All you could actually do was test it. What's more, if you had a lot of the material and you changed it by one atom, you could change it from gapped to gapless. That obviously is a huge problem for science, and yet has been shown to be an unsolvable problem. So there are some problems that are outside the scope of science that science can't be applied to. There are some problems within science that are just unsolvable. And the problems that science can solve, it is basically giving us our best. Just to reiterate, because I think it's really important, and I think it's important that people don't take me the wrong way, I have belief in science. I think it is fundamentally the greatest thing the human mind has come up with. I consider myself to be a scientist, and I consider my methods to be scientific, whatever that means. But I also recognise that it is in fact a belief, and so I don't hold it out there to be the ultimate truth. What I really don't like are people who would use science to pass whatever crazy notion they've got as being the truth because it is scientific. That I don't like. The other thing that I really don't like is those that would use science as if it were a hammer to beat somebody on the head with, in the same way that the Spanish Inquisition did, just to hold forth on their point. Those are the two things I don't like. And I think by pointing out that science is a belief, what you do is remove the power of that, so that that is less likely to be able to be done. Because if somebody presents something as scientific, you need to ask yourself, is it? Or is it just a belief they're iterating? When somebody tries to browbeat you with science, are they being scientific? Or is it just another belief that they're expounding? Now for me, the truth of a belief actually arises from the utility, that is, the use to which we can put it. For me, science is tremendously useful, and that's why I choose to believe in science. But I equally don't mind if somebody chooses to believe in something else. Anyway, I thought I would point all that out. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe.